Gari Yurangiari Wanjai, I greet you today in the Jandai language of my Nunako Aboriginal ancestors. I'd also like to acknowledge the Turrbal and Yagara whose lands we're meeting on today as the traditional custodians of country and to pay respects to their elders, laws, customs and creation spirits. These lands here in Meanjin have always been places of teaching, learning and research. And I'd also like to acknowledge other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who may be here in the room, as well as other First Nations peoples who are joining us today. So a short, never mind, I'm on the right slide. Okay, so overview is I'm going to just talk a little bit about data literacy, and I'm not going to spend too much time on defining that because I think with the expertise here in the room, we've got a pretty good idea of what that means, but just in case I will touch on it. Some background information on my study, the significance and benefits and the approach that I'm taking to do this research. I'll present some findings from the community study and from a staff study with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Community Health Service Brisbane, and I'll also talk about some of the factors which I'm embedding into the framework. So we're all increasing data we're using data at more increasing rates, primarily because we have such easy access through digital devices. I'm not going to go into too much detail, like I said, but data literacy does involve understanding and using data for informed decision making, improving understandings and for enhancing knowledge. And it's also a mechanism for empowerment, which I will talk about in a moment, as one of the two key perspectives of data literacy which have been identified around competency-based data literacy, and a lot of work and literature is out there on specific competency areas and really technical skills for different disciplines. And also the empowerment-orientated view, which moves away from that technical aspect to a more around as a means for empowerment and civic engagement, using data for decision-making and in one's everyday lives. This perspective also considers issues related to data privacy, data ownership, community engagement and social justice. It acknowledges that data is important in everyday decision-making processes and that the ability to understand and interpret data is rapidly becoming a requirement to participate in our modern society. So the research that I'm talking about today, the developing a framework for enhancing data literacy in this local Indigenous Australian community, the South East Queensland community, was conceptualised and co-designed with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Community Health Service Brisbane, or ATSIX, or AICS. So if you're hearing those terms throughout the event today, that's what we're talking about as a local community-controlled organisation. Input was received from community members through consultations, and what's really important first is that before any research was undertaken is we had conversations with community about data literacy, and what needed to happen within this space. So the approach that we have taken is an example of how Indigenous leadership has informed the research. And the question on whether community wanted to enhance data literacy is a really critical part of that, because without community's interest and desire to do this, this wouldn't be a project. So this research is important for many reasons, but Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples are, as what we know, one of the most researched populations globally. However, there are still a disparity around socioeconomic outcomes. There is a growing consensus on the importance of Indigenous voices in shaping policies, aiming to improve outcomes that benefit our communities. We've talked a little bit today around the National Agreement on Closing the Gap, so I won't go into too much detail there. And around Priority Reform 4, around closing the gap, is shared access to data and information at a regional level, highlighting the need for communities to have access to data to make decisions, data and informed sharing, transparency and capacity building, so that communities have access and ability to collect and use data. I've just realised I'm covered my timer, so I'm probably going to go over, so I'm going to just move on. However, as Professor Marcia Langton mentioned earlier today, the data is still not being represented in a way that is meaningful to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. There are still difficulties around access. There is some movement towards around Indigenous Data Sovereignty principles and embedding Indigenous Data Governance and culturally appropriate frame. However, there hasn't been any culturally appropriate frameworks developed around data literacy in the context of Indigenous Australians here in South East Queensland, and it is still lacking. So some possible benefits around this research: having a more understanding in the region around access, collection and use of data to inform decision making, and this may assist communities enhance their understanding and use of data, assert their rights in relation to data, and ensure proper data governance. It can also support agency, in particular to health and wellbeing. So, as I mentioned earlier, this research was done in partnership with ARDC Brisbane, and this approach used meant that we had taken time to build relationships with the community, and we listened to see whether data literacy was a priority. We looked at existing frameworks. Most were discipline specific and developed without Indigenous leadership. And we did a community study seeking perspectives from the community around what is data, how they're using data in day-to-day lives, and also the similar with the staff from the health service as well. And that's been incorporated into the findings. The next steps are going to be trialling the framework with the staff at Brisbane ARDC. That's where we're at the moment. So some quick insights on community study findings, and I think their voices are most important here. I think when I hear about data literacy, I think it is about empowering. Anything to do with the word literacy, I think, is about empowering our mob to understand data. That's what I'm hoping data literacy is about and what I think it could be. I think that it's the way that we live, be and operate within this world. Indigenous data is distinct. We all take it in different ways, but that's guided in a way that we view, and we're looking at it and a kind of thing that is viewed by our own positionality. And from the staff study, data is our clients' stories. I'd like to be more data literate, I guess, to be able to pull those reports, those numbers, those graphs, and really have that deep literacy around it to see where things are going. Okay, so where we're at the moment with pulling the information together from community and from the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander staff at ARDC is we are looking at defining data literacy in the context of the local community. That includes considerations around partnerships and feedback, identifying different types of data, because everyone was using different types of data in their roles, but also within their daily lives. And it could be things in relation to population health, wellbeing measures, cultural knowledge, stories and feedback. We are needing to consider communication around data in various ways that are relevant to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Empowerment, so individual and community to autonomously make informed decisions to influence the systems that impact their lives, and to possess the skills, knowledge and confidence to engage with data in ways which support wellbeing, uphold rights and prioritise Indigenous voices. And the final point was around the production of data, so making sure that the organisation in partnership with universities and researchers have access to the data that they need. And that might be through surveys or feedback, through yarning, community wellbeing outcomes. And I was hoping to have time to mention an example, but I've got 5 seconds left, so I'm sorry about that. Quickly, I'd like to thank the Indigenous Data Network, ARDC Brisbane, and QUT Centre for Data Science for supporting me to do this research. Thank you very much.